We are starting our session of the morning, and I'd like to present Jonathan Stutz from Switzerland. He studied theology in Basel, Rome, and Tübingen, and he graduated with a dissertation on the reception of Constantine in Arabic literature. He's currently working as a teacher assistant in church history at the Faculty for Protestant Theology at the University of Munich, where he's also working on a research project on religious violence in late antiquity. And today he will discuss tales of faith conversion, Constantine's conversion between polemics and political ethics. Please, you have to speak very loudly.
Yes. Thank you very much for the presentation. As already announced, my presentation will be about Constantine in Arabic historiography. It's taken from my PhD project. So I have to say sorry for those who expected something about the historical Constantine. And I also would like to, if I have the chance to meet Constantine, to ask him the question from Johann Wolfgang Goethe. Wie hast du es mit der Religion oder wie hast du es mit dem Christentum? How you feel about religion? But unfortunately, today it's not the session to speak about historical Constantine. Only one image for him, just to show how ambiguous the question is. 2 coins from his from the time of his rulership, when he was emperor of Rome. 1 coin with the Roman, with the Christian emblem on the banner, and below and above 1 coin with the Roman pagan divinity Helios. So till during his own reign, his own religious politics was not always a matter of clarity in this respect. But today I speak about the reception of Constantine, because Constantine not only had fascinated Roman historians like Eusebius or Socrates, but he also fascinated Muslim and Arab Christian writers, presenting a good case of how the legacy of the late antiquity could be transferred into Islamic civilization, and therefore showing a good case of reinterpretation and reappropriation of late antiquity in a Muslim, in an Arab context. One specific trope, literary trope, which I think to detect or which I want to present to you, which can be determined in Islamic literature, is the trope of Constantine's so-called fake conversion to Christianity. I would show this with the example of 3 writers representing each different literary, different aspects of Islamic literature, and showing therefore how this motif, this trope of Constantine's fake conversion, could be interpreted and functionalized in 3 different manners. Maybe we know, or as we can expect, one manner to interpret this is in polemical literature, and maybe the most famous case of polemical literature addressed against Christians where this trope is used is Abd al-Jabbar al-Hamadani, who died in 1025 of Christian era. He was a Mu'tazilite theologian from Rai, and is maybe one of the most sophisticated Muslim apologists of the early Islamic history. His refutation of Christianity is to be found in a larger work on Muhammad's claim to prophethood, and an entire chapter is dedicated to Christian history. And in this chapter, a recurring theme in his treatise against the Christians is to show that Christian history has been falsified, and that Christianity is nothing else than, at least how Christianity developed later, Christianity is nothing else than a pagan religion that Christianity was falsified through history, and that it adopted many pagan practices. 2 figures responsible for this process are the Apostle Paul and then later Constantine. And this pattern becomes clear and evident when Abd al-Jabbar speaks about the conversion of Constantine. He writes that Constantine was affected by leprosy, and that he was aware that he would lose his power in this way because pagan Roman Empire would not allow a king with leprosy to rule over them. And so he had to find the solution, his way out of it. And he found an occasion when he had to fight the barbarians, the Goths below the Danube. So we will come back to this later. He found out the device. He let his troops fight with the signs, with the pagan signs of the pagan divinities on their banners, but he took provisions to weaken his own army by not giving them the provisions they needed. And so, as expected, they returned back defeated. So Constantine took this occasion to blame the pagan divinities and to say that the worship of the Roman divinities did not benefit the Roman army. And so he ordered the removal of the pagan signs from the banners of the Roman army, and now he just needed an excuse to change them with the Christian signs, with the Christian sign of the cross. And he found this excuse as soon as there were rumors about a woman who saw a cross appearing in the sky with the promise, with this sign you will conquer. And so he found occasion to substitute to put the sign of the cross on all Roman banners, and he led the Roman army to victory. This account of Abd al-Jabbar blends together two different traditions about Constantine's conversion. The main bulk of this account relies on the so-called legend on the vision of the cross, which you may all know. This legend is first attested in the life of Constantine, written by Eusebius of Caesarea at the beginning of the 4th century, and has since then become well known in different variants amongst Christians of all confessional backgrounds. It relates, just to tell it very shortly, how Constantine had to fight against Maxentius, the tyrannical ruler of Rome, who persecuted the Christians, and that the night or the day before the battle, he saw in the sky the cross, the Holy Cross appearing to him with the promise, in this sign you will be victorious. And after putting the sign of the cross of the vision on the shields and on the banners of the Roman army, according to the version, there are several versions developed with time, he led the Roman army to victory. And obviously, we see already how the version which Abd al-Jabbar used, or how the version which Abd al-Jabbar employed, already showed some variants. The first variant is, as we saw, Constantine had not to fight against Maxentius, but against barbarian people from the Danube. This version is attested by in the beginning, in the introduction to the so-called Judas Kyriakos legend, the legend which theoretically develops about the theme on the discovery of the cross, which we heard yesterday. But the introduction of this legend also tells us the story of Constantine's battle against the barbarians on the Danube, and how he saw the cross appearing to him in that context. Other elements are difficult or impossible to trace back, like, for example, the fact that here it's a woman who sees the cross and not Constantine himself. But there could be a lot of discussion about other elements, but the second tradition which also combines here, and which also finds an echo in this version of Abd al-Jabbar, is the so-called Sylvester legend. The Sylvester legend developed in the 5th century Rome as an alternative to the historical account according to which Constantine would have been baptized only on his deathbed. The Sylvester account instead says that Constantine was baptized because he was affected by leprosy, and he tried to be healed by several devices. Some pagan priests also advised him to kill newborn children and to take a bath in this blood, but he refused, and he refused out of compassion. And in the following night, as we see on this fresco on the 13th century in Rome, Peter and Paul appeared to him on his bed and called him to call Sylvester, who would instruct him in Christian faith and baptize him. And so he did. He let Sylvester, the Bishop of Rome, come to him. He was instructed in Christian. Introduced into Christian faith, and he was baptized. And as soon as he was baptized, as soon as he was immersed in baptismal waters, his skin was healed again. Obviously, the interpretation of Abd al-Jabbar, the way how he deals, he binds together these two traditions, is polemical in its intent. While the Christian legend underlines the miraculous intervention from God to give Constantine a powerful sign about the truth of Christianity. And in the case of the Sylvester legend, while it's intended to show the orthodoxy of Constantine and his integrity in his Christian faith, Abd-al-Jabbar here questions Constantine's integrity at all. And he presents his conversion as a device, as a mere device to keep himself in power. In doing so, he wants to demonstrate that Christianity, in doing so he wanted to show that Christianity was just a falsification of the original message of Jesus, and that Christianity went through a process of several manipulation of the Christian faith, adopting pagan practices. And so, rather than speaking of a Christianization of the Roman Empire, it would be better to speak about the paganization of Christianity. And this pattern is common in many polemical writers who wrote against Christianity, so also later even Taimiyya, obviously with several differentiations to consider. But there are also other writers engaged in other kind of literature who use this trope of Constantine's fake conversion. One of whom is the historiographer Al-Mas'udi, and one of maybe the earliest Islamic writer to use this trope about Constantine's fake conversion when he speaks about it in the context of the Roman Empire. And from him, he authored dozens of works in history, but only 2 survived. And in the second one of the 2 books, of the 2 works that survived, which is also maybe his last work he composed, we find a similar story about the conversion of Constantine, as we already saw in Abd-al-Jabbar, but this time attributed to a pagan historian or to pagan writers. Honefer has introduced it, and the quotation is here on the wall. Others among pagan historians claim that he kept his sickness hidden and that he only informed one of his ministers about it. This minister practiced Christianity in secret, and Constantine admitted to him that he was afraid from an upheaval against him. The minister then recommended him to use the following device to remain in power. He sent one contingent after the other in order to fight against the enemies who were surrounding them. He put them under the name of the 7 divinities which are assigned to the 7 stars of heaven. Meaning the 2 luminaries and the 5 planets. And he introduces a remark: the Sabaeans used to bring offerings to them and practice their cult with great devotion. As he weakened the troops contingent, they were beaten and suffered terrible losses. The ministers then revealed all his contempt for these divinities and rebuked those who worshipped them. He then suggested to the emperor to convert, but he eventually did. And similar to Abd-al-Jabbar, Al-Mas'udi presents Constantine's conversion as a device to keep in power, presenting, however, now not a woman or Constantine himself, but Constantine's minister as the main agent planning the entire stratagem. And here in particular, also our Muslim historian, he attributes this account to a pagan writer. Now, unfortunately, it's not possible anymore to detect maybe a possible source from whom this account can be taken. We know that in Byzantine historiography, pagan historiography, was still present till late on. We may all know the Historia Nea of Zosimus, who, as a pagan, had a polemical attitude towards Constantine and who attributed Constantine's conversion to Christianity to Constantine's afflicted soul. Constantine, after killing his son Faustus and his wife Fausta and his son Crispus, would have found in the conversion to Christianity a chance to ransom his soul. But this obviously does not match our own account here. We could also speculate about possible Sabaean writers who wrote in the 9th, 10th century, Thabit ibn Sinan, for example, but their work being lost does not help us to find, to reconstruct the source basis which the Muslim historiography could use of. Al-Masudi does also present a long list of sources, but most of it, which is very valuable for us to see how Arabic historiography was already developed in the 10th century, but most of them are lost or are not, it's not always not possible to reconstruct them. But even if it's not possible to trace back the sources which Al-Masudi used, we can, however, try to think why Al-Masudi was interested in this account in the context of his own work. I think there are two reasons which can be mentioned, and I cannot go too deep into it. But the first cause of it may be simply given by his interest as a historian to give a broad variety of different sources complementing each other, giving priority to sources which from case to case can help better to understand the causes of the original event. We can read this principle, these empirical principles from in different cases. We read, for example, in the section also on Roman history about the theological debates of the 5th and 6th century that Al-Masudi was interested in giving accounts from Melkite, from Maronite, from Coptic and from Syriac sources in order to show his own objectivity about the issue. We also read in the section on Persian history that he wants to give priority to sources of Persian origin, or to sources which uses themselves sources of Persian history, bypassing therefore those sources which may have a more biased perspective on pre-Islamic Persia. And as a consequence, we may also feel that Al-Masudi was interested in a pagan source, real or not real it was, but that he was interested in the presence of a pagan source to show that also in Roman history, besides Christian sources, we still need also to work with sources going back to pre-Christian writers. Now, so maybe even attributing sources which he was not able to locate exactly, giving them the quality, therefore, of a pre-Christian source, therefore. The second, and this can be sustained by the fact that Al-Masudi does not have a polemical attitude towards Christians' account. In his first work, which was survived to us, Al-Masudi uses a traditional Christian account about the conversion of Constantine, and there about the vision of the cross, and there he showed absolutely no polemical attitude towards the Christian account. He just said the Christian said. So throughout his work he tried to put up a documentation of different sources and different backgrounds to create a network of texts which are intertextually related to each other. But the second reason why Al-Masudi seemed to give priority, at least for the second work, for this alleged pagan source, touches the question of what historiography itself should be about. Unlike the Christian's account, which tended to point out the miraculous intervention of God in history, Al-Masudi was more interested in the rational causes which are responsible for the origin evolution of political dynasties. With this, I do not mean that Masudi does not consider God as a factor, as an objective factor of history, but he was keen to show how human history can be detected some patterns of and some logic of evolution of political power. Al-Masudi understands historiography as a science which its own goal in presenting the strive for political power as an effective factor behind the history of that dynasty. We will see a similar pattern in Ibn Khaldun later on, 6,500 years later. And the pagan source, which with its focus on how Constantine was keen to keep political power, seemed to reflect better this intent of Al-Masudi to write political history and the evolution of the factor of power maintenance as a factor behind political history. And the third author which I want to present is Miskawai. He was a contemporary of Abd al-Jabbar, and now I have to find a page. Yes. I skipped the quotation because it's very similar. It's very similar to the one we found in Abd al-Jabbar, but here we find the interesting word when Constantine asked what stratagem he should use to find out from this problem. In the Arabic we find the word hila, and the word hila is repeated several times. Even the introductory story is, if it goes back to Miskawai, even the title is presented like this. And here we may also ask, does Miskawai has a polemical intent toward the stratagem, toward this device of Constantine? And if we see throughout the work of Miskawai, we see that the concept of hila, which could have a negative sense in the way of ruse, rather seems to have a positive meaning of stratagem, of artfulness. And we see the concept of hila throughout al-Masudi's work several times, throughout with several kings of pre-Islamic history, and even with the story of Muhammad's battle of the trenches. And we see that Miskawai's work, history work, the Tajarib al-Umam, the experiences of the nations, is concepted as a prince mirror literature, a work intended for present-day princes, rulers of his time, with examples of princes, of rulers of pre-Islamic, but also of Islamic history. And as he writes in the introduction, we see that, as he writes in the introduction, the concept of hiyal, or its plural hiyal, becomes a pragmatic term in his own work. We shall also discuss political affairs which are of concern for the building of cities, for the peace among the citizens, for the morale of the troops, for the means of war, and the artfulness of the leaders, including both the artfulness of those who are victorious over their enemies and of those who suffered from its consequence. And so, as we see the history of Constantine here, his fake conversion can be used as a metaphorical history for the prince who is able to use religion and the unifying and to leverage on the unifying effect of religion to unite his own dynasty. And we may ask if in this story also Miskawai had in mind his own political situation of his time. He lived in the time of the Buyid, of the Shiite princes, in a time where the Islamic Caliphate was also fall into disintegration. And it's interesting to see that a story which was used in a mere polemical way against Constantine or against Christianity by Abd al-Jabbar could here be reversed to a positive function and being introduced in a discourse of political ethics. And so even though apologetics may be one case where the trope of Constantine's fake conversion was used to, also larger, maybe proper discourses to the Islamic world, like that of political ethics, could be used to introduce Constantine into the Islamic world, and therefore even if Constantine was a Christian, somehow through this he was also converted to a Muslim ruler. So, and thank you for your attention.
I would like to introduce our next speaker, Yael Mabat, from the Zeldes Institute of Latin American History and Culture, Tel Aviv University. She is a historian of Christianity in the Americas, with particular interest in the Andean region. Her dissertation is titled "Keeping the Shabbat in the Andean Highlands: The Seventh-day Adventist Mission to the Peruvian and Bolivian Altiplano 1909. It was written, her dissertation was written under the supervision of Dr. Gerardo Leibler from Tel Aviv University and Professor Emeritus Stephen Kaplan from the Hebrew University. She is currently working into revising this thesis into a book. Yael?
Yes, just waiting for yeah. Well, I'm going to take everyone from late antiquity back into the 20th century and hopefully far away from Europe.
The microphone?
It doesn't work.
Oh.
The microphone. I'll try to speak as loud as my voice lets me. It's okay. We can do without it. I just wanted, since we're moving up into the Andes, and since I work about Puno, Peru, I just wanted to show you a map of where it was, so it would be geographically oriented. But I'll just, due to technical problems, we'll just let it go. At the dawn of the 20th century, while elites across Latin America were busy debating the state of their nation's Indians, one man in a faraway Andean village set out on a heavenly quest to redeem his race. Believing that the keys to salvation lied with the church, only not the Catholic Church, Manuel Camacho, an Aymara Indian and native of Puno, Peru, converted to Protestantism. He then persuaded many others to do the same. Heralding one of the most staggering Christian phenomena of our time, the mass conversion from Catholicism to various forms of Protestantism in Latin America, thousands of Aymara and Quechua Indians left the pews of the Catholic Church and were baptized into Seventh-day Adventism. By 1930, the church had established 10 mission stations and 60 schools across the region of Puno. Its missionary efforts yielded over 7,000 baptized Indians, and thousands more were associated with the church or influenced by its doctrines. In the long run, the Seventh-day Adventists became a political and intellectual elite with an above-average education and were well represented in local politics. Nevertheless, in 1911, when Camacho began his work, he was only able to attract a handful of men. Army veterans at the most part, the first Adventist converts, returned to their communities after spending an extended period of time on the Peruvian coast. Hoping perhaps for a warm welcome back, these men quickly discovered that only a few awaited them with open arms. Reintegrating into rural society turned out to be a very difficult task. Veterans encountered challenges in almost every aspect of life, from securing their livelihood to family relations and to economic life and just to making ends meet. Yet, it seems that their new habitus or cultural repertoire was particularly problematic. In the barracks, and while spending time in coastal cities and towns, veterans had adopted new tastes and practices which were associated with the mestizo world more than the Indian one. For example, as one Indian testified, they became accustomed to underwear and refused to give up their uniforms, shoes, or caps in favor of traditional Indian clothing. In a caste-like society, like the one that existed in early 20th century Andes, where race depended on cultural traits rather than biology, veterans' new practices and tastes were perceived as politically and socially dangerous. Now, the idea that culture could be the basis of racial identification might sound a little bit odd to anybody who is used to thinking of race strictly in biological terms. In fact, for decades, race, and as a result, racism, was considered a non-issue in the Andes, since miscegenation made it hard to separate between people through phenotype. Being an Indian or mestizo was determined on the basis of cultural characteristics, such as language or clothing or food, And as a result, social relationships were usually described in terms of ethnicity rather than race. This is in historiography and in scholarship. This view, however, has been strongly contested by scholars. They argue that race, and as a result racism, has been silenced. In their minds, race was a constructed category, whether its parameters were biological or cultural. And what made racism was not its biological aspects, but the intense and domineering power structures between humans it manifested. Terms such as ethnicity, while recognizing difference, don't elucidate. In any case, because race was constructed through culture, it could change. By adopting new appearances or new practices, one could transform, moving from being an Indian to a mestizo. Furthermore, the caste structure of Andean society meant that Indians had specific obligations and mestizos had certain prerogatives. Specifically, Indians were required to pay certain taxes or provide labor on the demand. Thus, an Indian who was able to basically pass and be recognized as a mestizo rather than an Indian was essentially a lost resource. You couldn't be used not for taxes and not for labor. Which meant that surveillance of these racial borders and of habitus was very, very important. Any case, Camacho and his fellow veterans were not even attempting to pass as mestizos. Their project was greater and more ambitious than that. They were, as they described in their own words, trying to regenerate the entire Indian race, to uplift the Indian from what they believed to be a degenerative state, and free him from his servitude and misery. In their eyes, adopting mestizo cultural traits was a part of indigenous renewal, not racial transformation. Furthermore, in veterans' own eyes, regeneration also meant a redefinition of their social and political obligations towards their communities, their districts, and the state. No longer should they supply labor or pay large sums to local authorities. Instead, veterans advocated that their responsibility was educating other Indians, teaching them Spanish, and preparing them for the military so they could serve their country. This view corresponded with other intellectuals' national and even transcontinental debates over the future of the nation's indigenous population, which I mentioned before. Thus, building on their own experience and cultural repertoires, these veterans delineated a new vision for the Indian race and attempted to implement it. In other words, we can distinguish between two disparate paradigms concerning the Indian and his place in society. One was the traditional and prevalent view that an Indian was a person who spoke an indigenous language, wore traditional Indian clothing, and was required to supply labor and pay taxes. The second, which these veterans were trying to promote, was that an Indian could speak Spanish or any other language, they later learned English, dress as he desired, and was required to educate himself and be prepared to serve in the army. Unsurprisingly, these two paradigms quickly clashed. In one such case, an acute conflict broke out between Camacho and the governor of his district over a school for Indian children. According to Camacho, while he maintained the school free of charge, providing the children with education, the governor was busy taking advantage of Indians and making them work for his own profit. The governor, however, rejected these accusations. Instead, he claimed that the exact opposite was true. While he recruited Indians to repair roads for the benefit of the entire district, and in accordance to local customs, Camacho was using the school for his own purposes. In another case, Indian named Wanka, who would later also become a prominent Adventist leader, litigated his rights over land by arguing that he served in the army. Wanka's claims were based on a long-established colonial pact. It basically said that land for tribute. Historically, Indians were supposed to pay head tax or pay tribute and provide labor, and in exchange, the government protected their rights over land and guaranteed their access to natural resources. Believing that military service could substitute for tribute, Huanca presented it as a contribution and then demanded the same rights taxpayers had. Yet the mere suggestion that his military service could replace paying tribute was a problem for those local authorities. District and communal authorities were an important link between the state and the Indians living in the communities. They were the one in charge of collecting these taxes and making sure the community paid its due, and tax was decided per community, not per person. Thus, replacing taxes with, or free labor with military service meant that their ability to fill quotas was diminished, and other members of the community were burdened with extra taxes they had to pay. So I'll just sum a little bit what I've said. Army veterans returned to their communities after having adapted habits and tastes and practices that were associated more with the mestizo world than the Indian one. Yet, rather than trying to simply pass as mestizos, these veterans insisted that they were in fact Indians, but of a different kind. Nevertheless, this vision of Indianness conflicted with other views of what Indians should do and who they were, putting veterans at odds with local authorities. As a result, veterans found themselves marginalized, subjected to violence, and even imprisoned. Yet what does all this have to do with conversion? And why did Camacho, Huanca, and other veterans seek the help of a foreign church and foreign missionaries? A simple answer would be that in face of the constant attacks they were suffering, they sought outside help. Yet, while this answer has truth to it, it misses the importance of Catholicism in local politics, and especially its role in the establishment and legitimization of political authority in the Andes. Religion had a long history of legitimizing sovereignty and political authority, with roots in both pre-Columbian and post-conquest history. After independence, the Catholic Church in Peru was able to preserve a significant influence, and Catholicism played an important role in the construction of Peruvian nationalism. The strong connection between Catholicism, sovereignty, and political authority was not limited only to the national level, nor was it simply a matter of symbolism. Catholicism and popular Catholic rites were embedded in the political structure of Indian communities and were a crucial part of the district's administration. The most salient example for this is the political religious system that governed these Indian communities. Also known as the prestige system, the idea is that one gained prestige by performing various duties in favor of the community. Obligations ran from delivering the mail to supervising cleaning irrigation channels to supporting and sponsoring important religious festivities. Catholic rituals were conducted to inaugurate people into various positions within this hierarchy, and it was virtually impossible to reach a high-ranking position without sponsoring at least one religious festivity. So furthermore, all communal activities were accompanied by religious rites and incorporated into a larger religious view. For example, tax collection ceremonies in the highlands took place on Christmas or St. John's Day. The religious ceremony was conducted by the tax collector himself, and there was a kind of symbolic reciprocal relationship forged between him, the taxpayer, and the taxpayer's dependents. The ceremony underlines communal unity, while also legitimizing authority of the tax collector himself through religious ritual. In other words, the act of paying taxes was symbolic as it was economic, and refusal to pay them was also amounting to challenging authorities and their religious legitimacy. Local politics, therefore, was embedded in religion, and vice versa. In fact, according to one intellectual, the puñeño indigenista, José Encinas, any kind of extensive social or political transformation among Indians could only be implemented through a religious framework. For veterans who were embroiled in acute conflict with local authorities, over their social and political obligations towards the community, conversion was an act of political protest and even political defiance. It eventually led converts to break away from these communities and construct new ones. By conversion, veterans repudiated the very thing that legitimized authority and power. In fact, Camacho went as far as calling popular Catholic festivities as a worship of an invented god, and accusing the priest, and by extension the local Indian authorities, the traditional ones that helped them, of being in the Indian exploitation business. The true God, converts believed, was uninterested in free labor. Instead, the Lord wanted Indians to learn Spanish so they could read his word directly, without depending on intermediates for heavenly or earthly matters. In fact, according to converts, the entire idea of social hierarchy was a Catholic invention aimed to exploit Indians. All humans, they asserted, were brothers and equal in the eyes of God. Yet, while in other contexts, equal before God was referred mainly to Judgment Day, converts understood it as a call for action and a way to challenge authority in the here and now. The Bible itself had become a source to legitimate political and social demands. One prominent activist, Carlos Condorena, was quoted saying that the book mentioned nothing about slavery or free labor, and thus these were illegitimate demands. This man went on to lead an indigenous rebellion and became a central figure in one of the first national organizations advocating indigenous rights. Others did so as well, using the Bible as a source to legitimize their claims and just saying that this is the true Christianity. Conversion, therefore, offered veterans a way to challenge political authority in a social and cultural environment where the two, politics and Catholicism, were tenaciously tied to each other. It revoked authority's religious legitimacy and forsook the social mechanism through which power was accumulated. Yet, at the same time, conversion to Seventh-day Adventism, an alternative form of Christianity, rather than a completely other religion or even secular doctrine, emphasizes the strengths of Christianity as a source of legitimacy. Finally, the Andes was not the only place where conversion to a non-Catholic form of Christianity served as a way to protest local authority. Earl Duncan, an anthropologist who studies rural Guatemala, points to similar cases where conversion was linked to the decline of legitimacy of traditional forms of authority, which were also associated with the Catholic Church. Emilio Williams, who was one of the first who wrote about Protestantism in Latin America, also suggests that converts were motivated by the will to bring about social and political transformation, first and foremost in their villages, districts, and neighborhoods. Thus, if we contemplate on the larger Latin American context and what we're seeing today, it may be interesting to think about the relationship between the massive conversion to evangelical and Pentecostal forms of Christianity and the surge of indigenous social movements, which is also very strong in the islands.
Thank you. Presenting Dr. Roman Shliakhtin. His dissertation on the image of the Turks in Byzantine rhetoric included one chapter that summarized Byzantine opinions of Seljuk Islam. Contrary to scholarly tradition, the section argued that the Byzantines tolerated the presence of Islam in their domains and did not problematize many conversions in Asia Minor. He is now, Roman Shliakhtin is a participant of a one-year program of Central European University in Istanbul.
Koç University in Istanbul, yes. Project on civilization of the walls of Constantinople. And my presentation today will indeed be on Constantinople. So after many travels around Byzantium on this conference, I think it's good to finally to stop for a while at Constantinople and enjoy the city. And we'll start in a second. Thank you very much. So, welcome everybody. Mighty building of Hagia Sophia, Church of Holy Wisdom of God, occupies, as all you will know, the hill in the very center, Second Rome, present-day Istanbul. In Byzantine era, the church was the main church of Patriarchate of Constantinople, place for coronation of Roman emperors, and it was also a place where educated bishops of Orthodox rite solved puzzles represented in canonical law. The name of the body that solved the puzzles was Synod of the church. And in the 12th century, Synod usually convened in the southern upper gallery, behind the spoliated marble screen, known as Door of Heaven and Hell. The summaries of Synod decision are preserved in many different sources, including the commentaries on the canon law, made by Byzantine lawyer Theodore Balsamonas. Educated at Constantinople in the 12th century at the imperial court, Balsamonas became nomophylax, the person in charge of petition of Patriarch Theodore Vradiotis, and later even titular Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch. In the years which are interesting to us, he worked in Hagia Sophia as a deacon and worked on the commentary on Byzantine law at the behest of Emperor Manuel Comnenus. In his commentary on Canon 84 on the Council of True Law, Balsamonas introduced a story of certain Hagarids who posed a problem for Orthodox Bishop of Asinor in the year 1169, and this was a problem of double baptism, or of not valid baptism. According to the text, to be analyzed in detail later, the Hagarids came to Synod and they were to be baptized, but they said that already passed through baptism in their childhood. Bishops asked the petitioners to provide eyewitnesses for the baptism, and when they failed to do so, saying that they were baptized in the land of Hagarids and witnesses are not available, the bishops ordered these people, converting people, to be baptized again. So this paper contextualized the second baptism in the socio-political landscape of 12th century Asia Minor and suggests to identify the anonymous Hagarids with a very certain group of Seljuk nobles. So my presentation will consist of three parts. First, I will introduce you to a rather complex 12th century landscape of Asia Minor. Second, we will read together the translation of text of Balsamonas, and third, I will suggest possible identification of this double baptism, and I will suggest who these Hagarids, who these converting Muslims could be. So, we start with introduction of Byzantium and the Seljuk Church. The Seljuk Turks were members of quite conglomerate of former semi-nomads who migrated from Central Asia first to Iran, then to Near East, and formed there the Sultanate of the Great Seljuks, and this happened out of the 11th century. In 1071, in the decisive Battle of Manzikert, Sultan Alp-Arslan defeated and captured Byzantine Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes. Immediately after the capture of the emperor, Byzantine nobles began their game of thrones. And these allowed Seljuk leaders, mostly runaways from the Sultanate of the Great Seljuks, to enter the Asia Minor with their elites and coined alliance with local Christians. The Seljuk leaders stylized themselves as sultans and emirs and formed nominally Muslim proto-states of Asia Minor. By the time of the First Crusades, Seljuks of Anatolia formed two main proto-states. One was focused on the dynasty of the Nishmedids, and another of the sons of Suleiman and Kutlumush that were based in Nicaea. In 1097, First Crusade, a proper elephant in the China shop, as everybody knows here, returned city of Nicaea to Byzantines and moved the capital of the sons of Kutlumush to the Seljuk Sultanate of Ikonia, thus forming a political landscape in Asia Minor for the most part of the 12th century. So there were three forces. There were Byzantines that controlled western part of the peninsula and most of the river valleys. There were the Nishmedids, who were there in the north, in the region of former Byzantine Paphlagonia. And there was Sultanate of Ikonia, which focused around Ikonia and dominated in the eastern part of the peninsula. I will introduce all these players, and you will see later how it all connected with the story of the Hagarids coming to the church of Hagia Sophia. So first about the Byzantines. New Byzantine dynasty, the Komnenoi, pushed through Cohen reform, caused the First Crusade and reorganized imperial mechanisms. Alexius I Komnenos, depicted here, united competing Byzantine families into one superclan and appointed his personal dependents, Douloi, to the position in bureaucratic apparatus of the empire. His son, John, and his grandson, Manuel, struggled to boost the imperial authority in the east and west, organizing military expedition to Italy and Antioch, and establishing complex relations with Latins, Armenians, Syriac Orthodox. The Byzantines effectively sought kind of pan-Christian compromise for their own political reasons. However, our focus today is not only on Byzantines, but on Seljuk Turks. In the 12th century, the conglomerates of the Turks in Asia Minor, Iconians and Danishmenids respectively, were based on the compromise between Christian elites and Seljuk dynasties. These dynasties, Seljuk dynasties, established themselves in Byzantine cities, used Byzantine buildings, and struggled hard to distance themselves at some point from the dominant Christian culture. Besides being Sunni Muslims, the Danishmenids and the Iconians struggled legalization outside of Byzantium. And Danishmenids contacted Caliph of Baghdad and asked him for a black banner and black turban and received the symbols of authority, while Iconians, Sultans of Iconians, struggled to prove their Iranian ancestry. They not only used Iranian names, but very physically imported Iranian Muslims, artisans and intellectuals, to the capital of Iconia. Still, the need to rule the Christian population of former Byzantine Asia Minor stimulated the communication between local elites and Seljuk Muslims, and to make this union work, they had to use old methods. For example, it's not really well known that the Danishmenids used Byzantine coins, images of Byzantine coins and Byzantine seals, and sometimes even Byzantine inscriptions, to position themselves as legal masters of former Byzantine province, or even as the agents of the emperor. This was one of the ways of communicating with their subordinates. In the Sultanate of Iconians, there was a certain fashion, if not a tradition, to take the Christian wife. The list of the mothers of Sultan of Iconian represented here is very clearly demonstrates that from year 1130 to year 1230, mother of almost every Sultan of Iconian was a Christian lady. So, with all this said, let's turn to our Haggarins, to the text of Balsamonos. And to remind you, Balsamonos, a Byzantine lawyer, includes a description of so-called case of Haggarins coming to Hagia Sophia in the discussion of 84th canon of the Council of True Law. So, the text of this canon discusses the question of baptism of children who do not remember how they were baptized. And here I quote from the Council of True Law. Often children unable to account on their age to answer satisfactory in respect to their baptism, where they baptized or not, where they baptized or not. Therefore, if they are found without trusted witness, they should be baptized again, lest such a doubt might deprive them of the sanctification of such a purification. Sorry for the complex text, but the canon law states explicitly, if there are no proper witnesses, and if the children do not remember their baptism, they should be baptized again. And then Balsamonos narrates his story of the Haggarins, which is the center of my presentation today. And the story goes as follows, I quote, "In the days of Holy Patriarch Luko Chrysoberges, Haggarins came to the synod and, being demanded to be baptized, say that they had been baptized in their lands. Being asked, how did it happen? They told that there was a tradition to baptize all the newborn Haggarins by Orthodox priests, but the bishops did not accept it. For bishops know, says Balsamon, that the unbelievers search the baptism of Christian not because of a good inclination and the wish for orthodoxy, but for the health of the body. Haggarins believe that their children will behave like demons and smell like dogs if they did not have Orthodox baptism. Hence, they accept the baptism not as a cleansing substance from all physical filth, and not as the light of the Lord, not as the holiest gift, but as healing or as a spell. Then comes the second part of the phrase, which I very much enjoy. Then comes the discussion, because Balsamonos says, some of the Haggarins say that they have Orthodox mothers, and due to their efforts, they received Orthodox baptism. But it was not taken into account, because there were no witnesses. They could not produce no witnesses to confirm this statement. More than that, the bishops accused the Hagarians of producing bad explanation that testifies against them. So it was decided to baptize them all. This case of Hagarians is rather strange from the very beginning. Some people voluntarily come to the Synod of Ecumenical Patriarchy, and Synod demands from them to pass baptism. Balsamonas, in Greek, which I do not reproduce here for its simplicity, narrates it in passive verbs. So one supposes that actually our author was not present in the hearing, despite being the deacon of St. Sophia, but most probably read the result. He had the minutes of this process, which he later introduced into his canon law. Yet, as one can see from the text is a direct dialogue between the collective Hagarians and members of the Synod. In this dialogue, the Hagarians speak, while Synod listens, asks, and makes statements. First, the Hagarians stating they are baptized, and bishops ask them to describe in detail, then they were not able to produce the witnesses, and they are ordered to be baptized again. This is all very strange because it's basically the second half of the 12th century. It's more than 100 years after the start of the Seljuk migration. And by this time, many Turks converted into Christianity in Constantinople. One of those Turks, named John Axopos, even became something like prime minister to Byzantine Empire, personal confidant of John II Komnenos. And probably, by the time we're speaking about, end of 1160, there was a protocol, or at least oral know-how, that regulated this conversion from Islam to Christianity. Same holds true for mixed marriages. As I demonstrated above, there were no wonder in medieval Anatolia, and almost every sultan or Seljuk leader had a Christian wife. The problem here lies elsewhere, and in my search for explanation, I look into historical context now of the 12th century. The possible explanation for all this story, and for appearance quite a page of modern edition of this commentary of Balsamonas, lies in the political history of 1160s. In the first half of the 12th century, Byzantine emperors, Alexios, John, and his grandson Manuel, played one Seljuk proto-state against the other, the Nishmedids against the Iconians. And this ambiguity allowed Byzantine emperors to control Asia Minor, divide et impera, without a proper occupation. They were able to make military action as far as Aleppo, being safe on the background simply because they controlled the Turks. However, Manuel Komnenos here decided to change the situation. Imagining himself and positioning himself as the Roman emperor, the emperor of the world, Manuel began to appoint dependent kings. In 1161, he chose Sultan of Iconium, Kalija Arslan II, as his representative in Asia Minor, as kind of supreme leader of the Turks in Byzantine hierarchy. Kalija Arslan of Iconium formally agreed to the proposal of Manuel, paid obeisance to Emperor in Constantinople, and immediately began to use the delegated powers to crush his opponents, the Nishmedids. In 1169, Kalija Arslan II captured the city of Ankara and exiled the Nishmedid rulers of the city. Simultaneously, he rejected the Byzantine power on the symbolical level and began to mint coins without any hint of Byzantine allegiance. The Nishmedids, under Prince Dzul-Nun, whose very name sends us to the question of Alexander the Great, appealed to Manuel and entered Byzantine service. So one group of persons, the Seljuk emirs, goes to Byzantium and enters the service. And their entrance into Byzantine service implied conversion to Christianity. From the late 11th century, the conversion of prominent foreigners usually happened in Constantinople, and sometimes, but not always, in the presence of the emperor, in Hagia Sophia, where the Synod of 1169, to discuss the case of Hagarians, took place. It seems possible to hypothesize that the Hagarians, about whom Balsamonas speaks so much, were actually not simple Turks, as it was argued, but the Nishmedid emirs, who were entering the Byzantine service. Their very status allowed them to discuss the matter of conversion not with a simple priest, but with the supreme representative of the Orthodox Church, with Synod, that sat behind the door of heaven and hell. They had the right to negotiate the conversion, very much like prominent businessmen, of the present day can negotiate their change of tax zone. Yet there is a difference, because as we know from modern history, one businessman enjoys freedom of movement, while other businessmen, unfortunately, are under duress. The Nishmedids in 1169 were under pressure. And While they informed the Synod about their consideration, about the baptism, they did not have much choice. The conversion of the Nishmandids to Christianity and their shift to Byzantine political authority came after a long era when the Nishmandids, to remind you, were the border brokers who lived very physically on the border between Christianity and Islam. Just when a generation before Manuel Komnenos, they were enemies of the empire and sought the protection of the Caliph of Baghdad. So now, to secure the political and religious conversion of this new group coming into Byzantine service, Synod of the Ecumenical Church decided to baptize them second time. Their second adult baptism that followed the decision of Synod aimed to secure their status in somewhere similar to the situation with the conversion of so-called new Jews of Latin America, about whom Professor Jezerski told us 2 days ago. Unfortunately, we do not know how did Hagarenes react to this conversion. Did they protest it? There is no data about it, yet in some years' time after this process, Manuel Komnenos changed the curse, Tomos, that every Muslim had to read before the conversion to Orthodox faith. Synod of Orthodox Church immediately protested this decision, and there was a conflict between Church and the Emperor going on for 5 years until year 1179. This demonstrates us very well that the control over the border that separated Christians and Muslims was important for Emperor and his Patriarch as well. It's nearly impossible also to know what happened physically with the Hagarenes after the conversion. Some of them probably perished in battles between Byzantium and Seljuks of Iconium, because quite soon Khalid Arslan defeated Emperor Manuel at Myriokephalon. Immediately afterwards, in the second half of the 12th century, he subjected the remnants of the Nishmandid Emirate, founding the Sultanate of Rum. That in the next 60 years saw its age of glory of Asia Minor, and the walls, palaces, and mosques of Iconium stand beautifully up to the present day. The Communion Byzantium was also near its end. In 1204, Fourth Crusade, as we know, destroyed the Empire of Komnenoi. Yet, the nobles of Seljuk, and more precisely of the Nishmandid origins, remains a significant group of post-Byzantine elite in the Empire of Trebizond, Empire of Nicaea, and in the Sultanate of Rum as well. Against all odds, former border brokers, the Nishmandids, continued in a way to exercise their power on two sides of Byzantine Seljuk divide. But this is definitely a story for another day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roman. Now we pass on to our respondent, Dr. Leonardo Cohen from Leonardo Cohen is an expert on Ethiopia and the missionary Jesuit mission to Ethiopia. His book, The Missionary Strategies of the Jesuits in Ethiopia, was published in 2009. Leonardo is a lecturer at the Department of Middle East and African Studies at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. And as I said, he's a member of our center, and now I give him please.
So thank you very much for these three presentations. Actually, it is an interesting challenge for me to link to find what we can share from these three different periods of time and three different regions. And after I finished to write my, I guess, short response, I decided to put the title Symbolic Praxis, Politics and Loyalty. And I want to carry out three reflections on these three presentations. And the first one concerns to the importance of symbolic practice. And just to say in general terms that the production of symbolic of symbols confers meaning on human existence. I think that these three papers provide clear examples of the relevance of the symbolic praxis in the generation of meaning for the convert, and also for those who interpret the conversion process. As noted by Roman, Byzantines did not care about actual religion of the Turks. However, in the case of the elite conversion, the situation was different. This second adult baptism that followed the decision of the Synod report by Balsamones, as he told, was precisely the second conversion, perhaps of semi-Christian emirs to Byzantine Christianity. It is clear that the Byzantine powers, ecclesiastical and imperial alike, he told, used baptism to secure loyalty in their new subjects, the Seljuk Turks. Indeed, it was properly explained that the second baptism enforces loyalty towards the political power. I think that the main title of this panel is also politics and conversion. So it is clear that indeed the work of symbolization obeys to a deeply human need. Symbols were created from the need for meaning, to create frames of reference that order the world, give a place to each thing and each person, integrate limiting situations that constitute the dark side of life, like death, suffering, loneliness, failure, and as in such example, to confer identity to the group. The aim was, as we have seen, to contribute to consummate the give meaning and to give political meaning to the conversion process. It is also evident from the example brought by Yael Mabat that religion had a long history of legitimizing sovereignty and political authority, as she told us, with roots in both pre-Columbian and post-conquest history, and by converting veterans repudiated the very thing that legitimized authority and power. Then, a symbiosis of symbolic religious practice with political practice can be discerned from these examples. Politics is often a symbolic one, and we can ask also Yuli Edelstein and Benjamin Netanyahu about that. And the symbolic gesture, on the other hand, sometimes constitutes a political practice. In this same frame, it is possible to put the question presented by Constantine according to Jonathan Stutz, and I'm quoting from him. So Constantine asked, what stratagem, Hila, could I make use of? They answered, use the following device, Hila, with religion. Christianity has appeared and was practiced only in secret till day. So the essential thing to emphasize in this first of the three remarks is that the Christian faith never exists disconnected of its political and social context. In Christianity, the belief is linked to practice. But the Christian tradition is characterized by the articulation not only of belief and practice, but also of symbolic practice and political practice. And just to suggest one example brought in this context by the Spanish theologian Alfredo Fierro, that he said, we can take as an example the symbol of a central sacrament of Christianity, the Eucharist. A Eucharist ceremonial that symbolized the physical presence of God in the altar and fosters the cult of Christ the King will normally constitute the symbolic correlate of conservative political positions protected by an ideology of divine right and endorses the immutability of institutions. On the contrary, a communal celebration of the memory of the Last Supper of Jesus, remembered as an exemplary type of free man, bearer of a popular messianic hope, condemned and executed by the institutional powers of his time, will be a normal correlate of creative and emancipatory political practices, stimulated by the utopia of a kingdom of God in a new earth. So to summarize this point, I can say religion also as eros and drama and art and poetics constitute a symbolic space in terms of communication. The religious gesture, like the symbolic gestures, has to be analyzed and judged with a criterion not fixed a priori, but according to the observation of the sociopolitical practices to which it is articulated. The second point I want to remark is about the political meaning of culture and manners in the process of conversion. And I think that Yael stated the importance of finding a solution for the superposition of identities in questions of manners and cultures among Camacho and the other colleagues of him. And then she asked, yet what does all this have to do with conversion? And I think that we should be aware about the cultural meaning of conversion, but also what we can call the importance of manners, as defined by Norbert Elias. Yes, manners in the process of conversion, of relating to a new culture. And in this context, I will suggest just a short example of my research. When the Jesuits were interested in the promotion of Catholicism in Ethiopia, they wrote, we are interested also on the promotion of what we call good, and they used the Portuguese word policía in Ethiopia. So in the Grande Diccionario de Lengua Portuguesa, policía means civilization. And in the Diccionario de Autoridades de la Lengua Española, we have three different meanings from this word policía. Policia. One, the correct order observed and kept in the cities and republics, following the law of rules established for the better government. Two, courtesy, good upbringing, and urbani in customs and manners. And third, hygiene, cleanliness, and pulchritude. So the dictionary also quotes Antonio de Fuentemayor, who says about the Indians, in their customs, they were not very different from the beasts until religion and the Spaniards taught them the policía. And the Third Lima Council recommended that the Indians not be just converted to Christianity, but also be instructed into living politically, since Christians' life demands and presupposes such a way of life. So, what is the link between manners and conversion? As instead Yael explained, and I am quoting from her work, that conversion offered veterans a way to challenge political authority in a social and cultural environment where the two, politics and Catholicism, were tenaciously tied to each other, and it revoked authorities' religious legitimacy and forsook the social mechanism through which power was accumulated. And the last point I want to emphasize, it's about the different understandings of the term conversion, that it relates also to what the paper presented by Jonathan talk about what they used to call the fake conversion of Constantinus. And here I want to bring also a quote of my former advisor of my PhD and the advisor of Yael, also Stephen Kaplan, that wrote, although it's something of truism, people convert in order to improve their lives. The crucial question is therefore how they understand and deceptively simple, that deceptively simple concept of improving their lives. In any event, it must be clear that to view certain motives as valid and legitimate and others as lacking in these characteristics tell us more about the researcher's values than about the converts. So in this sense, I think that the paper by Jonathan gives us a very interesting insight about the values about conversion concerning the people who wrote about it, like Abd el-Jabbar, concerning his account, and his doubts about Constantine's integrity when presenting his conversion as a mere device to keep himself firm in power. It's clear that, as he told, in doing so, he wants to demonstrate that Christianity was able to spread among the Romans, transferring pagan practices and beliefs into its teaching, and that the original teaching of Jesus was altered by the arbitrary decisions of single individual rulers, which not legitimate call from God to do so. These visions, of course, contradicts Christian accounts, which tended to point out the miraculous intervention of God in history. So I think that what is interesting in this third point that I want to remark is to look especially to this account of values given by the person who is telling about the conversion, and not only about the real values of the people who converted. So I think that was everything I want to tell to you. In case that you want me to sing Hallelujah, we can do it afterwards when finishing. And thank you again very much for your papers, and hope that I contribute anyway.
Okay, so then we'll open the questions to the public, and yes, Nadia.
Thank you. I just have a short question to Yael, a little bit longer for Jonathan. If the native South Americans saw the Catholic Church as an oppressor and as a way of enslavement, why did they change to another form of Christianity, such as Seventh-day Adventism, and not, I'm asking basically out of ignorance, were there those who said, let's go back to the Incan religions? I mean, was there an attempt to overturn Christianity altogether? And in terms of Jonathan, I assume you have a lot of these sources in your notes, but in case not, there are Jewish sources of Constantine and Paul, and the attributing to them, especially Paul, Christianity, and some of the polemical works which predate Abdul-Jabbar. You didn't mention Professor Penis's view of the Jewish Christians. I was wondering if you have a view about that. Curing leprosy by having a bath in children's blood. I don't know how far back it goes, but it's in the Midrash, and it was the explanation of why Pharaoh wanted to murder all the Israelite boys. And I was really curious about Sylvester. How far back does that go? Because I don't know Sylvester in Jewish sources until he became a folk hero in modern Israel, for those who understand what I'm talking about.
Sure. I think your first question, in a way, you have it right on the money. I also mentioned it at the end of my own talk that there's sort of a tension here, because they leave the Catholic Church, but they stay within Christianity, which basically illuminates how strong Christianity was. So they're rejecting this system, but they're not rejecting the entire discipline. That is one. And the second question is, yes, there is a scholar who is working on something very similar to my case, just on the other side of the border in Bolivia, and there the political activists basically said that they're going back to a pre-Columbian form of religion, which of course wasn't exactly a pre-Columbian form of religion, because after 400 years, you know, Christianity is there, but that was their claim, that they are
leaving the entire thing and just going back in time.
You have Peruvians who are doing that also?
Not that I know on the Peruvian, but it's possible.
One minute.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much for the indications. I tried also to look into Jewish sources. Obviously, I had not time to quote them all, but in the larger paper, I hope maybe to publish, I will also try to approach this issue. But on the specific motive trope of this device for conversion of Constantine, now this seems to be, for the moment, as I know, and if someone maybe has other knowledge from other historiographical traditions, I'm glad for any advice if this kind of specific trope is also present in other works. And concerning the Sylvester legend, yes, it is one of the big question: has the Sylvester legend originated? This is a big issue, yes, and it's for sure that the tradition that Constantine had to take bath in the blood of the children. This may have also may echo even much earlier traditions, and this is how tradition building in late antiquity also works. It's never you can never say where there's a point zero where a tradition starts. It's always echo something earlier, and yes. But on the Sylvester legend itself, on how it originated, this is a matter of a lot of lengthy monographs.
Is Abdul-Jabbar the first to quote? The first Muslim?
Yes, he is, and yes, Al-Nasudi and Abdul-Jabbar, the first Muslim writers, who seem to show an echo of the Sylvester legend, yes.
Yaniv and then Dov, and then Yaniv.
So I have two questions for Jonathan. The first is, there's a common feature of Christian anti-Muslim polemic, which is to deny the hero agency in the Revelation. So Muhammad is said to have been tutored by either an Arian monk or Jews. And do you think that in the case of the Muslim perspective on Constantine and the fact that he was given his visions by a woman or by his ministers, can that be perceived as some sort of reaction of Muslims to Christian anti-Muslim polemic? And the other question I have is just whether you could maybe expand a little bit on the circulation of Eusebius and Lactantius in the Islamic world, of which I know nothing. So.
The first is a good point. Yes, I especially in Muslim polemic writers like Abdul-Jabbar, they also have, or later even Taymiyyah, they answer the concrete Christian polemical works against Muslims, and and these Christian polemical works, yes, they reproduce also these kind of accounts of the prophethood of Muhammad was forged, that the Quran was forged, and so it's a good point which can be considered, especially for polemical writers like Abdul-Jabbar and Ibn Taymiyyah, yes, and on this point I should expand. This is right, yes. And the second point is Eusebius and Socrates. They were known in Syriac Christianity. They have been translated to Syriac. Muriel Devier wrote a long monography about Syriac historiography. I'm not aware of any Arabic translation of Eusebius or Socrates or other church histories of the late antiquity, but the big Syriac historiographical compilations of the 5th, 6th centuries, they were all using Socrates as a source, and then from there, and the big Arab Christian writers like Agapisov and Mabuk, they on them to use the Syriac compilation as a source. So it is an indirect transmission to the Arabic world, yes, as far as I know. So.
Yeah, a short comment to Jonathan and then to Yael. I will add perhaps a third factor, and it is a sense of continuity with the Roman world. In other words, if the Muslim writer, he thinks that the Islamic Empire is a kind of continuation of the imperial project, then we can expect, naturally, I will say, this kind of retranslations of the idea of the emperor into this new translatio imperii. Yeah, I will add to that, and to Yael, what it is I think very interesting, and is part of following what Danny said, is that if you convert not to Catholicism, but to, let's say, evangelism or Protestantism, by doing that, you are making two claims. On the one hand, you want to be westernized, if I can say. But on the other hand, in terms of, for instance, clothing. But on the other hand, you don't want to mix with the white European elite, which is supposed to be mostly Catholic. And this mestizo identity, it's not necessarily a way to join the hegemonic camp, but I will suggest to join a kind of, I will say, intermediary camp between the Indianness and the Europeanness, perhaps. And finally, just to remind that at this very moment, in many other places in the Catholic world, people were becoming attracted by Protestantism as a way of contesting Catholicism, not only in the Americas, but also in Mediterranean Europe, etc.
Your comment is very interesting. I have to think about it more deeply, but it's also important maybe to say that within Latin American intellectual elites, there's a whole, I didn't talk about it because I didn't have time, yes. There's a whole discussion about Protestantism as a more modern religion. It's related to Western Europe. There's a discussion about immigration. Catholicism is seen as sort of like a remnant of the past, of this Hispanic past that put us in our terrible situation. And if we want to have immigrants from the more advanced countries, we should be more Protestant. So there are intellectual elites who see Protestantism favorably. So I'm not exactly sure how everything fits together. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, these intellectual elites who see Protestant favorably, they're not converting. They're becoming secular. They're adopting socialism or communism or liberalism or whatever secular ideology they have. So they're sort of just a little more sympathetic because they see it as modern, as a much more modern religion than this Catholicism, which is old and Hispanic and useless, basically, in their own eyes.
Yes, please.
So to Yael, as far as you know, did the church change its attitude to the Indians after the Second Vatican Council in the 60s or later, and challenge its own pre-relation to them, listening better to their claims against it after the 60s, more or less?
According to the Bishop of Puno, which I had a very interesting and extremely bizarre conversation with, yes, that was, even though he's very conservative, he's like Sirpiani is the bishop now, is the Archbishop of Lima, and he's very, very conservative, he's Pope John Paul, but he said that the attitude has changed, and that is why the indigenous people are returning to the Catholic Church. I don't know, this may be a little bit wishful thinking on his part. I haven't investigated scholarly. I'm just saying what I saw being there. But according to him, yes, they are now returning in the thousands to the Catholic Church. I'm not. I think it's maybe a little bit his wishful thinking. There are charismatic Catholic movements across Latin America that are becoming very popular. They basically take a lot of the Pentecostal practices, but do it within the Catholic Church, and that is very growing religious stream as well.
Yes, please.
I have a question for Jonathan. At least as I understand it, looking backwards from the early modern period, it sounds like the medieval Muslim historiography you're describing takes this polemical trope and turns it almost into Machiavellian. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but a kind of show use of religion for political ends. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more. Are there other examples in this medieval historiography of that? And in particular, is it attributed to Muslim rulers also, or is it always like a discourse of the other?
Yes.
That might be a big question. But.
No, it's a very interesting question. Well, the political discourse was, the literary genre of mirror prints was very well established in Islamic literature, Al-Thalabi I think as well, and also other works. And the art of rule and which devices to use to keep political power was widespread, especially in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, and interestingly in a time of disintegration of the unity of the caliphate, where the once united caliphate was divided into small emirates. And in the case of Miskawai, he was writing for his Buyid emir, who was a Shia dynasty governing over, I think, a majority Sunnite population, Sunni population, and so even religion could become a kind of device. And Al-Masudi is maybe, for the early Islamic history, one of the most he does it in the most systematic way, but later on, Ibn Khaldun, in his theory of civilization, of how civilization evolved, and he is 500 years later, so a lot of time passes, but Ibn Khaldun uses a lot of al-Masudi in his historical account. So, I think the discourse in political ethics was had its own presence in Islamic literature, quite, much before we know it by Machiavelli.
Federico, and then you.
So actually, we're saying that's my extreme tiny knowledge of Islam and kind of stuff is that Yael has also
can you raise your voice for me?
Raise my voice. Yael has also a legalistic use in order to distinguish between exegesis and specific context. So I'm wondering, since you were speaking about a very similar term, if this idea was a trickery for converting, if there is also some legalistic implication into that kind of emerging sentiments with respect to legal terms. So, in other terms, if you could elaborate that, interest in this also in theological political terms, if there is any kind of relationship to the legal attitude behind that.
I tried to track back a little bit the concept of hiyal or hila in Islamic jurisprudence, but and I'm not an expert in this field, so maybe can also maybe give other insights. There, I had the sensation that it was quite negative in a negative sense, and so that I could not go far with this track, and this also highlights the value of the political discourse of Miskawai and other thinkers, that they used hila and hiyal also in a positive sense, but maybe someone who is expert in legal discourse here can give me maybe some insights which I can develop further.
It was you, yes?
Yeah, hi. So this is a question for Roman. So I thought your reading was convincing of why the second baptism. I was just curious, in the canon law, it describes the first baptism as being against demons, etc. And I was wondering if we can read into that any kind of anthropological knowledge, or that's just in a way an insult against these people. And also if you could speak a little bit about animism or any kind of practices we know from the Seljuk Turks from prior, and if you could mix up. So.
Thank you very much. for this question. I mean, it's hard for us now to judge the 12th century and the knowledge and the situation of the 12th century, simply because, again, to introduce the audience to this, the Seljuks in the 12th century in Asia Minor, they didn't write about themselves. There is the history writing started in the 13th century, and these Persians, about whom I spoke, were imported from Iran, Ibn Bibi namely, who write for them their chronicles. And the last thing they would like write about is, of course, this kind of strange borders things that happens. But from the materials that we have very late, of course, 19th, 19th, 20th century, from the territories of Asia Minor that were inhabited by the Semen nomads that supposedly are there from the era of the Seljuk Turks, and there are such regions in modern-day Turkey, we can say that yes, there is an anthropological component supposedly behind it, because even in the 19th century, there were holy places, at least, if not the same tradition, that were exercised both by the Christian nomads and by the Muslim nomads in the regions we describe. It's Paphlagonia, it's Upper Meander Valley, so it was still there. Some people say that it was there even up to middle 20th century. There were a group called Yorubs, who were semi-nomads, who lived in the mountains, and yes, preserved something similar practices. It's not known that they baptize their kid, but sometimes, in the case when somebody is ill, they go to Christian priests to receive baptism, or they go to Christian holy places. This led to emergence of a whole network of this holy place, especially dedicated to St. George, because St. George was paralleled with Green Hither, the leader, one of the kind of holy figures in the Sufism, if I may say so. So there were some traditions that were common for Christians and Muslims alike, but there must be some anthropology behind it, but we don't know really exactly which.
Nimrod?
I'd like to add to the question of Hila and then move to the other questions. Yeah, so in terms of Hila, the schools of law are divided about this. And so you have the Hanafi school, which accepts it and uses it, and you have the Hanbali school that rejects it. So in terms of the legal discussion, there's not one consensual position. But of course, if you put it in a different context, the word Hila can easily change the sort of the nuance of whether it's positive or negative. When you move it to historiography, it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. I hear this case from you, but I don't know other cases. So that's with regards to the term Hila. Now, with regards to the question of politics and religion, Islamic tradition is very comfortable with this. I mean, as you were saying when you gave the examples of the later historians, but it actually begins with Muhammad and Muhammad's biographies. He's very often presented as someone who is very skillful with regards to how he uses politics. He's sometimes very almost cynical in many ways, and the tradition presents it as him maneuvering within a certain space, political space. So in that sense, I think that what you have presented makes perfect sense. You just simply took it from the middle on, but if you go back, you'd see it's very, very similar in traditional Muslim sources. Therefore, my question is, the one that seems to stand out is Abd al-Jabbar, who, as you were saying, kind of gives it a negative connotation. So my question is, what can you think, even when you compare him to the other historians that you mentioned, why does he take on this relatively negative position?
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting insights. Maybe after I come to ask about the legal tradition, because it's interesting. Yes, Ibn Abd al-Jabbar, he was not so. The fact that he was using it in a mere polemical way maybe made him shows how the polemical intent of his work, in which we find this account, follows its own inner logic, which is to show this, to follow a more theological discourse about the original purity of a religion, and and as you see, especially late in Ibn Taymiyyah, also when he tries to follow the same pattern. we see maybe more a kind of in the Muslim debate of how Islam should follow its or keep the loyalty to its own origin. So maybe, and even Abd al-Jabbar as a Mu'tazilite had also was also part of an in-Islamic debate. So I don't see in apologetic literature of Abd al-Jabbar or Ibn Taymiyyah so much as a kind of outreach of Islamic literature to Christians or Jews, but more a need to position themselves inside Islamic debate. And when for Ibn Taymiyyah, Christianity is a shifter for Sufism and Shiaism, which according to Ibn Taymiyyah also was altered during time. So it follows its own logic, which has nothing to do or not so much to do with the discourse of political ethics.
Yes.
Jonathan, your sources use the word faith, or is it yours? Because it seems to me there's a step further between saying that you didn't convert because of faith, but because of other reasons, and saying this is fake. And just another question later to Leonardo. The relationship between politeia that you talked about and the Greek politeia, which refers to quite similar area of human behavior.
Yes, I think it's from the same source. I mean, I was talking about the Spanish and Portuguese word.
It goes back to the Greek origin.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
You had another question?
Yeah, to John.
Yes. No, the concept of fakeness itself, I do not find it as my way to find a tentative tentative way to designate this kind of literary trope. But maybe images like forgery or change, falsification, this is recurrent, especially in Abd al-Jabbar, yes. This kind of tahrif,
so they assume that faith is the main basis for conversion.
Well, yes, this is what the point is. All these authors, they started from the point of Constantine that the conversion of Constantine was not related to his integer religiosity, but was always a kind of second thoughts behind it. Be it the keeping power, be it the trying to check out the military problem. So this is what then I try to group under the concept of faith. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah. I'm interested in the belief of the converter as a Trojan horse who actually corrupts the new religion. So to Jonathan, when we are speaking about early Muslim historiography, so in Abd al-Jabbar narrative, we have also Paul, maybe it's more relevant, and we have another narrative in this early historiography, which is about Abdallah as-Sabbah, who is the Jewish converter to Islam in the first generation, the early generations of Islam, who actually was accused in corrupting Islam by inventing Shiism. And this narrative also started maybe from the 9th century onward. So it's interesting maybe to compare those kinds of narratives that are dealing with this kind of a converter who's a Trojan horse who actually corrupted a new religion of Islam or Christianity.
Yes. Thank you for the examples. Paul, in fact, is maybe Abd al-Jabbar is very harsh on Paul, even harsher than Constantine. Paul is the original sin of Christianity. Abd al-Jabbar, because he made the original message of Jesus practicing the Roman religion in pagan lore. But I did not know about this other example, so it's good that to see that yes. Abd al-Jabbar in Muslim polemics, they use similar patterns of thoughts when applying also in Islamic discourse. So at the end, the apologetics shows that it's not just addressed to outside, but also to inside the Islamic community. as a kind of identity, as a kind of to show where the borders are of our true religion.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we'll finish this session and reconvene at 12 o'clock, and everyone can have coffee.